Disenchanted. So Disenchanted is the sequel to the 2007 live-action animated musical Enchanted. And to be honest, the build-up to this film for me was kind of a bit overlooked. I kind of completely forgot about the fact that there was going to be a sequel to Enchanted. I remember watching the first film way back in 2007 and thinking to myself, this is truly one of the most beloved and most energetic musicals that I've seen in recent memory. And I was hoping for exactly the same for this sequel. One thing I did appreciate about this film was that it was a sequel that was made, 20 years after the original film was, and they didn't exactly rush into it. They really took the time and effort to come up with a story that would be justifiable to the original film. And that often works because we've had sequels in recent years that have been very successful in comparison to their predecessors, which were released, 10, 20, 30, 40 years prior. So I did have a high degree of expectation going into this film and hoping, fingers crossed, that it was going to be equally as good as the first film was. So 15 years after her happily ever after, Giselle questions her happiness, inadvertently turning the lives of those in the real world and Andalasia upside down in the process. So the story kind of sounds very much like the first one, in which it has a very kind of straightforward narrative structure in which it, introduces the characters. There's a problem, there's a crisis, and then there's a solution and there's a resolution. That's pretty much what a Disney story looks like, and this one follows suit again. But because we were introduced to Giselle and the world that she was originally from in the previous film, that we got to understand the aftermath of that and how she settles into the real world, while also looking back to her original roots and how she sees the world that she's currently living in and compares it to her past and where she originally comes from. And you get that in the narrative in which Giselle and her family move into this massive mansion, which does kind of resonate with a castle in many ways. And seeing Giselle move into this area with her family does kind of strike that kind of tension between using your imagination and that depiction between what's real and what's a fairy tale. And we know from the previous film that Giselle does have these very cliche philosophies, and they are very apparent in this one as well. But there's a lot more tension, I would say, in this one. And what I mean by tension, I don't necessarily mean suspense. I mean like a bit of, friction, where there's a bit of conflict between reality and imagination. And a lot of people have come to know fairy tales as this kind of happy story in which characters are introduced and they defeat the villain, and then there's no kind of conflict at all by the end of the story. And this film does depict that, while also at the same time shows that the grass isn't always green on the other side, so to speak, that not all fairy tales are meant to be happy, that sometimes they can create further problems, especially when in this film it kind of plays with the real world by adding other things in another dimension into the dimension of the real world within this film. It just creates more of a war, so to speak, and a lot more friction between those two realms. And ultimately it shows why fairy tales don't exist, because they don't depict the reality of what the world is like. And I'm probably going slightly off topic here, but the point I'm making about this film was that it was a film that really kind of showcased the traditions of a fairy tale within the real world, made them work together, while also showing some intertextual references to the classic fairy tales we all know and love, and blended them into one story. And the narrative does mirror a lot of the traditions of fairy tales that we've seen in the past, especially like the old Disney animations such as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Cinderella. And that's how the story in this film kind of unravels, because it's all these fairy tales that kind of come together as one whole story. And I think it was a bit of a risk, I would think, initially, because it might create confusion, it might create something that really kind of felt a little bit disjointed, especially in the middle. But it actually worked quite nicely, and that's particularly because you were focusing on Giselle's journey, while also other characters who were like references of the other Disney fairy tales that we've seen in the past. And as cliched as the story is again, you can't help but feel that warmth and that magic of this sequel as much as you did in the first one. The story itself is just enough to just put a smile on your face and just feel pure entertainment from the very beginning until the very end. And the production values were, as expected, absolutely brilliant. The art direction and the costume design were absolutely spot on. They really captured the awe and the, magic and enchanting, pun intended, feeling of feeling part of this whole imaginative world. And while I don't think the musical numbers were quite as powerful as the previous film were, they were still very good additions to the story and just allowed us to understand the characters a lot more, that drove the narrative forward. And of course, Amy Adams returns as Giselle, having previously played the character in the 2007 original film. And I think what I love about Amy Adams as this character is that she presents herself as someone who is very charismatic and just very elegant in how she delivers a performance, while also at the same time gives us a very cliched and traditional Disney princess character. Because the character is quite overly dramatic, a lot of actresses would have probably tried to perform but would have made it a little bit cringy, and it's something that could so easily go wrong. But Amy Adams was just absolutely perfect for the role again, she really was. And one point about Amy Adams' performance in this one compared to the previous film is that you kind of saw two sides to her performance. You'll have to watch the film to find out, but you kind of see one cliched and, you know, innocent side to her, but also something a bit different as well. And that's what I think is a testament to Amy Adams' performance too. And of course her vocal performance, again, very energetic and very powerful too. Another key character in this film was Morgan Phillip, who was played by Gabriella Baldacchino. The character of Morgan was 6 years old in the previous film, as she was portrayed by Rachel Covey, but now she's in her teens. And Morgan had a much more significant role in this film compared to the previous one. And it's particularly her relationship with Giselle that kind of shapes up the story in this film, in terms of that stepmother and stepdaughter kind of dynamic. And the performances from both Gabriella Baldacchino and Amy Adams were absolutely brilliant. They had such great chemistry together. Although there was one character I wasn't particularly keen on, and that was the villain Malvina, who was played by Maya Rudolph. And maybe that's because Susan Sarandon's villainous performance in the previous film really kind of set the bar and the standard for the expectation of the villain in the sequel. And unfortunately, it didn't quite fit for me. Because yes, it was predictable like the previous one was, but you just didn't really kind of feel that villainous kind of connection with the performance from Maya Rudolph, in my opinion. She didn't even feel like something like a panto villain, and that's why I think she lacked a bit of personality. But that being said, it was nice to see James Marsden, Patrick Dempsey and Idina Menzel reprise their roles from the previous film. So overall, Disenchanted is a very refreshing and delightful sequel, and it is a film that a lot of people would expect it to be. Cliched, theatrical and predictable, but it is also magical and charming enough that almost makes us completely ignore the flaws from the narrative and some of the performances. So of course it isn't a film that's going to be taken seriously, but for children and families and just pure entertainment, it really delivered, and I'm really glad they made the sequel. And while I wouldn't necessarily say it's as good as the original film overall, it's still a very strong sequel that was just, you know, a justifiable follow-up to the original film. What did you think of Disenchanted? Do you find it a bit disappointing, or do you think it is as good, if not better, than the original film? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you did want to enjoy this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and have a notification bell ticked so you're notified when I upload a new video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.